So, welcome to a rather different Tippling Philosopher video, whereby I am going to interview Alan Duval, who is a contributor to the A Tippling Philosopher blog on the Patheos Non-Religious Network. I am looking rather odd because I'm presently undergoing HSCT stem cell treatment for primary progressive multiple sclerosis in a clinic in Russia. So I look a little bit like Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in my whites with a hat. So if I break into madness and start talking to the walls, I do apologise. But today's topic is going to be free speech. And free speech is one of those really interesting subjects that divides a lot of people and causes a lot of headaches, primarily, in my opinion, because there isn't really a good answer that satisfies everyone. So we're going to be dipping into an article, possibly a little bit, written in the Vox, I think, between a political philosopher and someone else. But essentially, we're gonna take this down our own little pathway. And Alan, first of all, what are your qualifications as someone who contributes to a Tippling Philosopher and who has something to say about free speech?
Well, I came onto a Tippling Philosopher as someone who was at the time doing a degree or had just finished my BSc in psychology. I'd done my dissertation in the psychology of morality, and so looking at the work of Jonathan Haidt and in fact debunking certain aspects of Haidt's work as being insufficient to actually properly explain morality in the broad sense. So my interest is in morality in a very broad sense, and the way in which we engage with the conversation at a psychological level. So it's not free speech per se, but obviously as a fairly opinionated individual, free speech is an important thing to have opinions about and to be relatively clear as to what is and isn't, an abuse of free speech. And therein lies the rub, because what some people call their free speech, other people call an abuse of free speech. And I think that's an interesting thing to sort of get into.
I think that's a perfect segue, because when we talk about what people should or shouldn't do, for example, should you be able to say X or Y? Should we have free speech? Straight away, we're talking about moral philosophy. So you have your moral oughts. And so, as ever with philosophy, everything always appears to derive back down to morality. So I'm sure we'll be talking quite considerably about morality within the confines of free speech. So how would you define free speech then?
Well, therein we immediately come to a bit of a problem, because at its most fundamental, it's the freedom, hence the word free, to say whatever you want. But as with any freedom, there is a speech equivalent, I think, of the your freedom to swing your fist stops at the end of my nose. And I think that's probably the thing we're struggling with the most in the social media era, is just how much can we put at the feet of someone's free speech when it comes to someone else's hearing that free speech and going out and committing a hate crime. Milo Yiannopoulos. And so that's kind of the battleground at the moment, it seems to me. That and the conflation of free speech and money in the States, and in fact the conflation of the individual and the business or the corporation or whatever. And so. To my way of thinking, what's happened is, before we've even defined it properly, the lack of definition has been co-opted by people who would subvert the conversation in the first instance. And now we've got dark money pouring into American politics, and we've got people standing behind their right to free speech, whilst busily fomenting dissension amongst people who go out and do the rest of the talking with their fists.
Okay, so before we dive down that rabbit hole, which is quite a considerable rabbit hole. What would you consider would be the advantages of free speech? I mean, why is free speech held up as such a paragon of libertarian and free virtues? And I suppose we could talk a little bit about the freedom of the press here, particularly in the context of the American Constitution, maybe. But what would be the advantages of a free press?
Well, I think free speech. Yeah, I think one of the things that comes out of the work that I did on morality is that things have their opposites, and I suppose we probably all at least relatively aware of the idea of positive and negative freedom per Berlin, and I highlighted that in my dissertation. And obviously that's a fairly important distinction to be made when you're talking about libertarianism, because they talk about both types of freedom in different ways. But I think that when it comes to free speech, what often happens is the liberal idea of free speech, as distinct from the libertarian idea, is the ability to speak truth to power. And, whereas the libertarian ideal seems to not really have that function. It's very much more about almost breaking away from the powers that be, rather than being an individual speaking to power. That's the impression that I get anyway. So
would you say, to just try and key into that, would you say a liberal would be, and sometimes this is a case of, we talk about this in comedy sometimes, so a liberal might punch up. If you're going to use your free speech, you're going to use it to challenge the power structures in order to be of benefit to the greater society, whereas a libertarian might both challenge the power structures, but also challenge those out-group members who might be less fortunate themselves. And in fact, the libertarian is more likely to spread their speech into hate speech, for example. I don't want to get onto that yet, but there are different kind of areas whereby these groups of people concern themselves with free speech.
Yeah. The thing that seems to happen is that libertarians, particularly in America, I mean, when we say libertarian, we almost invariably end up meaning people who sometimes self-style as classical liberals, but we're talking about American libertarians. And in America, of course, libertarians are seen as predominantly being on the right, which for a number of reasons is wrong. I mean, they're pro-drug use and all that sort of stuff. But fundamentally,
sorry to interrupt, but
libertarians seem to do in the States is they seem to stand behind conservatives and use them as a human shield.
They often misinterpret themselves as libertarians. So you get people who stand up in Congress who say they're libertarians, but then will say no to immigration, no to drug use, no to this and that. And in fact, they're not really libertarians, they're corporatists. And so I think the term libertarian can be bastardized quite considerably in America.
Look, I think in all honesty, in both politics and religion, a lot of people self-identify one thing, but the realities of their activities are different from how they self-style. I mean, one that I like to trot out to that's non-political but religious instead is the one about in Pew back in 2000 and I think it was as far back as 2009. There was a study that they did where they found that 45% of American Catholics were unaware of the miracle of transubstantiation. Now, that is one of the key tenets of the faith. So how can you genuinely call yourself Catholic if you don't even know what transubstantiation is? Yeah. But on the other hand, because it's religion and you don't get to call into question someone's beliefs because it's sacrosanct, if you'll pardon the pun, all these people who don't believe in something which is key to the faith of Catholicism can nevertheless call themselves Catholics. And I think the same is true in politics. Politics doesn't have the thought-terminating cliche of God to sort of enable that, but nevertheless, a lot of people will label themselves as one thing and then behave in a completely different way.
So the benefits of free speech then would be it's almost more useful to look at the negatives of not having free speech. So if you're in a very authoritarian regime where you are unable to take Saudi Arabia, and let's talk about religion, or gender politics, and you're standing out to say, right, I should have the right to believe what I like, I should have the right to drive a car if I'm a woman, I should have a right to show my face, and yet saying those things can end you up in prison and possibly at death. And so therefore free speech, or the lack of free speech, it curtails enlightenment and a zest and a quest for knowledge. So I think the positives of free speech go hand in hand with progress and with seeking knowledge and finding solutions to problems that may exist.
Absolutely. The thing that I think doesn't seem to make it into the free speech conversation anywhere near enough is there needs to be, and I've sort of already prefigured this by mentioning the Citizens United Act in the States, where corporations can have free speech in the form of money, and free speech at the individual level I don't think is ever a problem. Where it's a problem is when it's wielded by entities, be it government or corporate or whatever. And I think at the point at which a body rather than an individual, or an institution rather than an individual, is claiming free speech, then I think they have to conform to a much higher standard, and that's a standard that should be policed by the populace. And so to give an example of how that might work, I only slightly jokingly suggested in the run-up to the Brexit referendum that we should actually have a quick poll, like a multi-choice questions at the top of the ballot, asking people to, sort of show that they knew what the EU was before they voted to leave it. And everyone's immediate response was, yeah, but there'd be a massively long debate about what those questions are. And I went, exactly. So we would actually require truth to be in the public square when it's entities that are making it. But individuals, because they have very little power, they can say whatever they want. But the moment it's a monetized YouTube channel, or it's a company or a whatever, they need to be held to a higher standard. And I don't think there's any problem with policing that. It's when you start policing individuals for having thoughts and ideas, that's where the problem seems to me to arise.
I think I might disagree with you there to a degree. I agree that the power structures of these money-making enterprises who wield inordinate amount of power that can manipulate those who are less powerful than them into doing their will by using money freely in a kind of substitute for, I suppose, in advertising, that's where they're transferring into words or manipulating or using in boardrooms or whatever. But these things happen on individual levels as well. Take, for example, I had a freedom of speech debate with a friend of mine some time back, who's a teacher. He teaches older children than I do. And I said, look, you think it's fine to say whatever you like in a classroom. If I walked into the classroom and effed them blind at 10-year-olds and then told them to do things that were wholly inappropriate, but I had that power structure over them, yet I was merely exercising my freedom of speech to say those things, then I could cause an inordinate amount of damage to those children, long-lasting.
Sure. But I think actually you've underscored my point, because if you've walked into the classroom, you're either a teacher, and thus you are speaking on behalf of an institution, and so absolutely you should be stopped from effing and blinding to the kids, or you're not a teacher and you shouldn't be in the classroom at all, and so the fact that you're exercising your free speech is somewhat secondary to the fact that an unknown male has just walked into a classroom.
Okay, so imagine I walk up to a child on a playground then, or in the public. So are we now replacing a kind of formal written contract with the school with a social contract?
I don't think so. I think that may be a false dichotomy. I'm not suggesting for a moment that just because we hold institutions and the either appointed or self-appointed spokespeople for those institutions, that we must necessarily then allow absolute free rein to the individual. All I'm saying is that if you start with the institutions and force them to abide by a code that is somewhat the social contracts in style, insofar as it is broadly agreed that these things should not occur when being said by, like, I mean, holding political parties to account for, for when they're saying what they're going to do in their manifesto or whatever. It should actually be reasonably close to reality. And when we do it with advertising standards, it should be possible to do it with politicians. But anybody, and I'm sorry, any institution should be held to a higher level. But that's not to say that because we're doing that, that we then give individuals free rein. In just the same way, to refer back to that article that sort of started this conversation, in just the same way that we wouldn't let someone whip out their cock and start masturbating in public. There are things that we think are appropriate or inappropriate that we pretty much all agree upon. And effing and blinding at 10-year-olds is probably, that is actually assault by the current definition of the law. So,
but who does become the arbiter of these scenarios? So, for example, if I go up to someone who's either younger than me or more infirm than me, or basically less intelligent and more manipulatable than me, is it right for me to be able to say what I like because I have the freedom to do so, and I under the inalienable rights of the country, for example, I might have the right to say to these people what I want, but in the end, what that might lead to is me taking advantage of them in some kind of way.
Sure. And there's already law that covers that. So it ultimately comes down to who makes the complaint. If the individual that you're trying to manipulate is sufficiently self-aware that they make a complaint, they could complain to the police. And, if you're trying to exert control over someone for whatever reason, there are laws that cover that. If it's their carer or someone who looks after them in some way, be it family or institutional, they too have the ability to make a complaint about an abuse of someone's authority. So I don't think there's really a problem there,
the problem
any more than we already have that we're trying to grapple with anyway. I think it's quite possible for you to exert your free speech, but as the saying goes, but you aren't immune from the consequences thereof. So
in other words, free speech is only free as so far as the law will allow it, and that depends upon the law of the land, and it depends largely on the feelings of the person that you are speaking to. And this is where we get into this murky, where we're talking about clear-cut manipulation, where I'm taking advantage maybe of a minor or of someone else and getting monetary value out of them or whatever. But if I'm saying something that's hurtful to someone else, this is where we get into the real quagmire of free speech.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So, if someone calls me some kind of baldy novice, right? and I take massive offence of that because of my present medical situation, then am I being too sensitive? Do I have the right to be up in arms about that and call that hate speech? And this is a slippery slope, the kind of Socrates paradox type I always go back to, which is where do we draw the line of hate speech and freedom of speech?
Yeah. No, well, absolutely. I think fundamentally that offence is one of those things which is very difficult to quantify. And I sort of harken back to Stephen Fry's comment about, I'm offended. Well, so fucking what? There's a big difference between being offended in an instance and an ongoing program of offence. And so it's no longer free speech, then it's a pattern of behaviour. And patterns of behaviour are things that come under all sorts of laws that already exist. So, because one of the big problems that I've got with this idea of offence, I can be offended by things all the time. What was it that Frankie Boyle said? That I'm offended by boy bands, but I don't complain about it. It's one thing to be offended, and it's another thing to say that no one can disrespect Muhammad. that there you've got an institutionalized hair trigger for offence, and I would suggest that that's inappropriate. And certainly for Muslims that have moved into the UK or some other Western country, then that hair trigger is going to have to learn to be less triggerable. But likewise,
okay, so to play devil's advocate, why should they have to learn to? I mean, imagine, you and I are clearly non-Muslims, right? I am an atheist, but and so I don't really understand the nature of being truly offended by someone slagging off some deity who's far more powerful than I will ever be. By proxy. I mean, that's ridiculous. But if I had the capacity to be truly properly offended, and say instead of a deity, that's my wife, and you come and absolutely slag off my wife,
right.
I might feel similar sort of reactions to that. Then where do we go from there? I mean, do I have the right to be offended? Do you have the right to say those things?
You have, I think at a very basic level, you have the right to, that person who is slagging off your wife has the right to say those things, and you have the right to be offended. Where I think it becomes problematic, there's two aspects of it that can become problematic. One, some people can take offence, failing to take into account context. And so if someone says something that's offensive in ignorance, then it's really inappropriate to hold them, they say ignorance is no excuse. I disagree. I think if you're ignorant of someone's trigger for offence, that's not your fault unless you actually had that discussion.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, if, a one-off instance, okay, offence, so what? It's not criminal. But if it's an ongoing pattern, then, as I say, there are laws that already cover that, because and even one-off, if it's like offence, and then I have reason to believe that the belligerence with which this person is insulting me could lead to a physical offence, that actually falls under the heading of assault right there. If you have reason to believe that they're going to attack you as a necessary consequence, as a follow-on from what they're saying, then that's already assault.
And this comes on to incitement of hatred. But I think there's a really interesting thing where you are verbally bloodying someone's nose. That is often enough for them to physically bloody your nose back, and that be an acceptable sort of state of affairs. So if I'm that,
I agree, but yes, it is often seen that way, certainly.
if I'm that harsh to you, then and you are that aggrieved, then yes, I have the right to do that. But you would feel you have the right to hit me back, although the law might say otherwise.
Yeah, and it's the classic escalation, isn't it? It's when diplomacy fails and we start a war. I mean, it's just the individual level version of what happens in international politics. But and absolutely right, there's a lot of murk that's going on there. But I think that there is a surprising amount of law that already exists that covers off an awful lot of this. And I don't think that when it comes right down to it, that the issue of free speech is as difficult as everyone makes out. It's just that people spend an awful lot of time talking past each other with their definitions. And as I say, if we hold institutions to a higher account, and individuals can say what they want, but they likewise aren't completely that they can't avoid responsibility. I mean, it's the classic, yelling fire in a crowded theatre thing. If someone's trampled to death when you do that and there wasn't a fire, then there's what would be called contributory negligence or something along those lines in sort of legal terms. So
yeah,
I think there's a surprising amount of law. It's that transition, I think, from the spoken word to the physical act. That's where most of the debate seems to end up being is what can we agree causes someone to act when someone else has merely been speaking.
I think speech
acceptable
is something that carries meaning in the same way that actions carry meaning. And although they may have a physical dimension as far as impacting maybe flesh and whatnot, there isn't actually that much difference between speech. Speech is an event, right? And we use physical.
It's symbolic.
Yeah, we use physical parts of our body in order to communicate speech to other people in the same way that we would shake someone's hand. It does the same sort of thing, and so, but somehow we differentiate the two things in law by saying that you can say these things, but you can't do these things. You know, and I find that quite an interesting idea. I mean, there's interesting things to do with sort of burqas and motorbike helmets and transactions, where you know, if I walk into a shop and I'm wearing a motorbike helmet, I should be made to take it off because it's an unfair transaction between two people where I can read your body language, you can't read mine. And these are the arguments I hold against full-body burqas, because speech is transactional and should be fair. And if it's not fair, someone is manipulating someone else. But that's a rabbit hole there. But certainly, I think we do have a habit of differentiating speech from action, where sometimes it might not be wise to do so to that degree. I don't know.
Sure, you know, I can absolutely see where, you know, I mean, it's the sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me thing, where actually names can be incredibly hurtful. And, you know, there are numerous countries around the world that have just verbal abuse on the statutes as, you know, an actual crime. But again, we're talking about something which forms part of a pattern. So I think there's a reasonable distinction to be made between freedom of speech, which is you can say what you want, and the point at which you start becoming haranguing or harassing, which is the ongoing program of saying the same hateful things to the same person over and over. Say it once, no problem. Say it multiple times in an ongoing way, and you know, co-opt in other people to do the same thing. You know, like dogpiling on Twitter or YouTube or whatever, then that's where it becomes a problem, because that has properly moved from speech as a single instance to an ongoing pattern of behaviour. And I genuinely think that's where the battle lines should be drawn as far as free speech is concerned. It's like, yeah, you can say whatever you want, but if you keep saying it and keep harassing or abusing or in some way causing an activity to occur, like, I mean, Milo went on and on about, you know, when he was harassing the woman from the Ghostbusters movie about, you know, oh, I didn't set them on her, you know. It's like, well, you say that, but every other time you've said something, you've caused all your minions to dogpile. So there's a reasonable expectation that doing it this time is going to have the same effect. So, you know, that's a pattern of behaviour, and with a pattern of behaviour, he's expecting an outcome which goes beyond the purely verbal.
Do you know much about Jordan Peterson at the moment?
I know a little bit about Jordan Peterson. I know enough to know that I'm not terribly fond of him.
So he's getting quite a lot of. He courts quite a few different sides, really. He says enough to, I think, appeal to the alt-rights, whilst
and
academic enough. I think he's got his, you know, he'll say things, nebulous things about religion that means the religionists think he's all right, but I'm not really sure he's particularly sort of Abraham.
I think the thing about Jordan Peterson is he is an absolute master at plausible deniability. He will say something that will be taken the way he intends it, or the way it seems as though he intends it, by his actual audience. But when someone else who intuits what he seems to mean, who kicks up a stink, and who's being all snowflakey about it or whatever, he can say, well, no, that's not what I said. Look at what I said, and point to the words. And it's just, you know, the coded speech and the dog whistles and the reading between the lines and all that sort of stuff. You know, it's the subtextual stuff where he knows exactly how it's going to be received by one party, and it'll either be completely missed by the other party, or they'll see it, but he can deny that that's what he's been saying. And he's really, really good at that.
What would you say about the other party? So the kind of social justice warrior type of people who get up in arms about supposedly the merest of verbal infractions on Twitter or whatever.
Yeah.
How do you feel about oversensitivity to freedom of speech?
Oh, it is a big problem, and I think for me, the biggest problem with the oversensitivity is when you're being oversensitive on someone else's behalf, because then you're infantilizing them to a degree. And I mean, you know, yes, there are certain people who are so far down in the power structure that they need champions, and I totally get that, and that's why social justice warriors can have that term for themselves and not feel put down by it. But there are some that take it to extremes, and you know that they're insulted by everything. They take offence at everything, and they take offence at things that sometimes the intended target of said offence isn't even offended by, and that's problematic. And then it's the sort of oppression Olympics and all those sort of things, which are net negatives on that side of the balance sheet, but they are nowhere near to the extent that the Jordan Petersons and so on of the world make out.
Well, actually, this is a really interesting point. So I think sort of radical feminists and SJWs and people on the far left really at the moment are getting a hard time by tarring the whole of the left with that brush by the right. And I think people forget how vicious the far right is. So they say, oh, listen to these people, and they're getting up in arms about saying this and how they're snowflakery, and yet and you go over to like Stormfree and all these kind of like right-wing neo-Nazis just saying the most despicable stuff, but because we're so used to it now, it's like that's a white noise.
If you'll pardon the pun.
Our new focus is on the SJWs, and they get an inordinate amount of airtime that's probably not warranted.
But I think it's true in both directions. I think the far right,
these guys.
Yeah, I think the far right are also a relatively small number of very noisy individuals who tar a lot of the right with the same brush. Now, I mean, it's a problem in the States because as far as what they think of as you know, liberal and centrist or left even is actually centre-right to the rest of the world. I mean, Obama was not, I mean, he was somewhat, liberalism in and of itself is a centrist ideal. It's not left, it's centrist. But because the right in the States is so right, they think of liberalism as being a leftist way of being. Obama is centre-right. You know, Bernie Sanders is a leftist. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a leftist. Obama wasn't. He was good, and he proves that, you know, people on the left can get along with people on the right, but the people on the right in the States are so far right that Obama to them was anathema. Also, he was a black man, but you know, that's another thing again.
So I think you know, not that we've particularly gone down many holes here. I mean, to wrap things up broadly, it's a bit of a mess. So you have people who have a freedom to say what they like. You have people who have a freedom to be offended, and then you somehow have to arbitrate that through legal ways. And we do have rules about inciting hatred, but again, you know, there are, as with any law, there are grey areas around that, and you know, what is someone's right? I mean, the core point here, I mean, my core point would be that rights don't exist. Right? Rights, a human right is an abstract concept that we have constructed in our minds over time, and the only time rights have any meaning is when we codify them into law. Otherwise, they're just words. Like I could say, I've got
even once they're codified into law, they're just words.
I've got a right to call you a stupid Kiwi knobber, right?
And you would be fairly accurate on that.
I would never do such a thing, although I've just done it. But that I don't have a right. I've just said it, and I've said I've got a right. If there's a law that we in this country that we all adhere to by some kind of social contract or by some kind of legal ramification or framework, that means that if I say that to you, something will happen, then I don't have a right to say that to you, or I don't have a legal right to say that to you. So I think human rights don't exist. I think legal rights do, and they are the end result of talking about human rights. When we decide by consensus to encode them into law, then they become legal rights. Otherwise, whatever.
But then again, most human rights have been codified into law, if not as individual laws, certainly as the guiding principle that has created the laws, and so they exist in a de facto sense by virtue of those laws. I would go one step further and say that, you know, laws and so forth don't exist in the sense that they are not a natural occurrence, but they do exist in the sense that we recognise them as part of the furniture of Western society, to sort of narrow it down to what we're most familiar with. I don't think there's any problem saying that
you write them down and do something if you break them.
Exactly. But on the one hand, you've got behaviours, and on the other hand, you've got words, and this is in a way that almost the mirror image of the what we were talking about before, with regard what I was suggesting before about how mere words aren't a problem, but words that translate into action are. But in this instance, we've got a case where if there is a law that says you can't do a thing, and if you do that thing and that thing happens to be speech, then it is going from the abstract to the physical, because there is a physical consequence for the thought and not. I mean, yes, you made the good point that a word is a deed insofar as it's an act of speech, but fundamentally saying something, generally speaking, is not going to be breaking a law unless you're obviously passing secrets to other governments or whatever. But generally speaking, the mere fact of speech is just the mere fact of speech. It's when that speech makes a transition to an action that we seem to have a problem. And likewise, we seem to recognise that because when we say something is illegal, what we do is we then create a physical punishment that we say is in some way appropriate for the level of infraction that has been represented. Now, if that infraction happens to be verbal assault, that's free speech, but it's also a pattern of behaviour that has led to another pattern of behaviour, i.e. imprisonment, or at the very least being brought up in front of a judge. So it does seem to me as though it's the thoughts, words, actions. It's that transition, and it seems to be between the words and the actions that we have the thing, and that's where law is as well. Law, as you rightly say, is just words, but those words have an impact that alters action, or creates action, or pushes action in a certain direction, or prohibits action even. So it's actually a relatively small gap, I think, that we're talking, and free speech and law are all in the same space.
So free speech is generally a very good thing in an active democratic society where we want to challenge power structures effectively, and where we want equality of opportunity, and where we want enlightenment and knowledge to progress. Where it can go wrong is where we use it for manipulative ends that can disadvantage specifically people who are less fortunate than ourselves.
And bear in mind as well, the only way this works as well is education. Yeah. I mean, we haven't even got onto the fact that part of the problem with, one of the biggest problems around free speech is you've got people who are highly manipulable because they are in an unfortunate situation, either less intelligent or just have had less access to education, sometimes both. And so they can be, they are much more readily turned to more violent behaviour. We have the term radicalisation in our, in our everyday speech now, because this is the thing. You can take people who are impressionable because they don't have the psychological wherewithal to sort of go, no, that's wrong, and be encouraged to become a physical agent of that other person's words. And again, that's where you're taking one person saying, go kill X, and that other person is then going and killing X. So it's that transition from speech to action that is the problem. But if we arm people, like the Philosophy for Children program, encouraging children from a young age to learn how to think in a meta sense. So learn that other people have different ideas, and learn how to, that just because you've entertained the other idea doesn't mean you've adopted it. I think that's so. I think it was Socrates that said that the mark of a great mind is to entertain an idea without adopting it. It turns out that neurologically that's not quite correct, but he was somewhat right. So, teaching children how to hear other people's words and not take them on board. Well, isn't that what offence is? Offence is taking someone's words seriously, so seriously that it impacts your ability to get on in the world. Well, no, it's just words.
Yeah, so there is, I suppose, something to be said about oversensitivity, to go back to the kind of world of the SJWs. So it's about, both sides taking responsibility for their own actions, one in not trying to upset. I mean, there appears to be a lot of people who want to upset other people, who get joy out of upsetting people, because there are lots of people who are very easily upset. I mean, I have twin boys who one will wind the other one up precisely because he knows he can wind him up, and the other one gets wound up precisely because he's weak enough to get wound up. Do you know what I mean? So that dynamic exists in human history and humanity, and it's something that we obviously need to be aware of. Otherwise,
and both parties contribute negatively to the situation. The one that gets wound up too easily needs to learn. I hate to use the phrase, but to toughen up. Yeah. But equally, the one that's doing the winding up shouldn't be doing it, because that's a shitty thing to do.
Yeah, and they won't get far in life, or they'll get.
Yeah, well, no, actually they will. That's the unfortunate thing, because capitalism absolutely rewards the people, the winder-uppers, and the people who will happily tread over other people's feelings to get where they want to go.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, interesting.
I was reading an article just the other day that found that children that yell, and like young pre-verbal children that yell and scream, are more likely to be millionaires when they're adults.
Really?
I thought that was kind of interesting. So
yeah, that's quite depressing. Well, actually, that means one of my kids might well do well.
He will be able to keep you in the manner in which you intend to become accustomed.
Yes. Well, look, Alan, I think that was a nice whistle-stop tour through freedom of speech, and may inspire us to talk about it again in more depth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or at a different level, and hopefully we can have a couple more of these if you have some spare time during my incarceration in a clinic.
Come on, what did you say? I mean to start this conversation by saying Zdravutsia, but
I love Putin. He's great.
Well played. Well done, comrade.